What's going on, my people? Welcome back to another episode of the Stop the Count podcast. In this episode, I will be breaking down the UFC and the amazing boxing schedule over many different promotions, as well as Chivas' next game. First, for boxing, I'll talk about a very low-key fight that will be happening in Mexico. I'll only mention the main event, and that is former world champion Luis Panterita Neri versus Froilan Saludar. This is just, in my opinion, a very good fight for Neri to keep him active, and I would still pick Neri to win by knockout. Now, he has had multiple disciplinary problems in the past, and I just hope everything goes through as planned with this fight. Diegopacheco will also be fighting in Mexico on Friday. I won't be watching this fight, but I have no doubt that Diego will come out victorious. Now, for the big Showtime Boxing card, first talking about a couple fights and fighters that I will be looking forward to. The first fight is edwindelossantos going up against josephadorno. First, talking a little bit about Adorno. I was really high on him a couple years ago, but as it happens with many young fighters, I believe he let the fame get to his head. Adorno was once regarded as one of Top Rank's biggest prospects. They're going to be fighting at 135 pounds, and that's a very tough weight for Adorno to make. It was during the pandemic that he did faint in the hotel room trying to make this weight, and still eventually missed the same weight his next fight, which was probably the biggest reason for him being let go from Top Rank. Talking a little bit about Edwindelossantos, he's very hard-hitting, and that was shown in his last fight. Edwin knocked out Rayo Valenzuela in 3 rounds. Now, he was also hurt in that fight, but he was still able to knock out Rayo. And I do believe that's how this fight will end. Edwin de los Santos will win by knockout. Now, for a fighter, yoelvisgomez, he's going to be fighting Marquez Taylor, and I would be surprised if Yoelvis doesn't knock him out. For the main event, jaronennis versus roimanvilla for jaronennis' IBF interim title. I'll start this off by talking a little bit about jaronennis. Ennis has a record of 30 wins, 0 losses with 27 knockouts. He's what most people see as the real boogeyman of the welterweight division. Prior to his last fight, he was on a 19-fight knockout streak. So we have only seen a small sample size of his game, but in that small sample size, he's made a huge statement. Getting into his game, he's obviously a hard puncher, but the pressure he applies on his opponents is just as important. There's very few fighters that could hang with him before draining themselves. Boots does a good job controlling the ring and fighting with his jab, but when Boots takes a more of a boxing approach, he's a very effective counterpuncher, and he really mixes up his attacks very well. Head or body, his opponent always has to be aware. But again, like any other young fighter, when Boots feels safe, he starts playing around in defense. But honestly, Boots' jab is the key to all of his fights. Now, for his opponent, Roimanvilla. Villa has a record of 26 wins, 1 loss, with 24 of his wins coming by knockout. In his last fight, Villa fought a previously unbeaten fighter, Rashidi Ellis, and won a majority decision. That was an outcome very little people expected. But his lone loss came a little over 4 years ago in Mexico by split decision. Now, how I see Villa as a fighter, I believe he is a very good, durable opponent, and that's not afraid to take chances. Villa does a good job counterpunching. He's been able to get out of the way out of some hard shots in the past. Will he be able to do that against Boots? I highly doubt that. Villa does a good job pressuring his opponents, trying to control the ring and force his opponents into the corners or the ropes. Now, due to Villa's counterpunching style, he does get hit a lot, and most of the shots are clean shots right to the chin. Now, for who I have winning the fight, in all honesty, there is no way I see Villa winning, as I think Jaron Boots Ennis is the much more skilled fighter, and I also believe he has too much power. A Boots knockout would be great, but Villa is a very durable opponent. Next, the GoldenBoy Boxing card, headlined by Vergilortiz going up against eimantasstanionis, first Stanionis WBA regular title. First, talking about some prospects on the card. The biggest prospect in the GoldenBoy stable is on the card, and that is floydschofield. He is fighting a tough, well-tested opponent, and I'm expecting a great performance from Floyd. Also on the card is erictudor. It should be a great performance from him as well. There is another championship fight before the main event, and that is marlenesparza putting up her WBC and WBA flyweight titles against gabrielaalaniz, who will be putting up her WBO flyweight title. This is a guaranteed banger. First, I'll get into Marlene. She has a record of 13 wins, 1 loss, and has only won 1 time by knockout. Her lone loss was to Senisa Strada almost 4 years ago. That fight was stopped after a clash of heads, but she was losing the fight. Now, I feel Marlen does a good job timing her opponents. Marlen also does a good job countering her opponents. She has a good jab and is very fundamental to her game. Marlen also has times where she gets too confident and starts trying to show off with her defense, and that has led to her being dropped a couple of times in her career. Now, getting to gabrielaalaniz, she has a record of 14 wins, 0 losses, with 6 wins coming by knockout. Her last 3 fights have all ended in knockout. In her 14 fights, she's only fought an opponent with a positive win differential 7 times. Now, as for how I see Gabriela, she is a very active fighter. She is also very smart. She knows how to keep her distance, but when Alanis attacks, she puts it all out there, usually being able to hurt her opponents. Now, this is her biggest test she's had. As for who I have winning this fight, as of right now, I believe Gabrielaalaniz will win this fight. Now, for the main event, eimantasstanionis versus Vergilortiz. First, talking about Stanionis. He has a record of 14 wins, 0 losses, with 9 wins coming by knockout. Stanionis has not fought in over a year, and in his last fight, it was close. For how I think Stanionis fights, he does a really good job working the body and setting everything up with his jab. Stanionis will also stand toe-to-toe with his opponents, which in this fight, I don't believe it will benefit him at all. Stanionis has shown before his stamina holds up into the later rounds, while Virgil has only gone to the 9th round once. Now, for Vergilortiz, the Texas native has a record of 19 wins, 0 losses, and is one of the few top level boxers to have a perfect win to knockout ratio. Now, Virgil has had some problems in the past with an illness called rhabdomyolysis. This fight was scheduled for April but had to be postponed due to this flaring back up. And it wasn't the first time. Before his fight with Michael McKinson, this same thing happened to Virgil. From the little I know on the illness, it makes your body really sluggish and it could lead to even worse things happening. What causes this illness? Who knows? Some people attribute it to a banned substance, but I think that's bullshit. I attribute it to overtraining. All I can say is I hope Virgil is fully recovered from this, as he is truly one of the best young stars in the sport. But talking about how I see Virgil fight, he obviously is a very hard-hitting fighter, as he has knocked out everyone he's been in the ring with. Say what you want about his previous opponents, but it's extremely hard for someone to knock another person out. Virgil opens up widely at times, and that causes him to take some extremely dangerous shots. That was seen especially in the Igas Kowalowski fight, where it looked as if Virgil was dropped and hurt multiple times before getting the knockout. Virgil also has a very high ring IQ as well as amazing footwork and feints. Now, for who I have winning this fight, I'm going to be completely honest. I think Virgil Ortiz is going to get him out of there. Virgil is not the more complete boxer, as I think Stanionis is better, but he's just a dog, and that's what this fight is going to be. It's going to be a dog fight, and Virgil will always win that fight. I believe Virgil will win by knockout. Now, for the UFC 290 International Fight Week card, headlined by Alexander Volkanovski putting up his undisputed World Championship against interim champ Yairrodriguez. Now, this is an absolutely stacked card with many great fighters on it, and also many great prospects. There was supposed to be an amazing fight between Sean Brady versus Jackdellamaddalena on this card, but the fight was cancelled after Sean was hospitalized earlier last week. Jack will remain on this card, and he will face Josiah Harrell, a very tough opponent. Another fight that was rescheduled to put onto this card was tatsurotaira. He will be fighting on this card against Edgar Chairez. They will fight at a catch weight of 130 pounds. Tatsuro's last scheduled fight was cancelled as his opponent couldn't make weight. I'm very high on him, and I can't wait to see how he performs in this fight. And also on this card is undefeated Cameron Simon. He's fighting Terrence Mitchell, and I want to see Cameron fight, because in his last previous fights, he's had some trouble keeping them clean. So we'll see if he is truly a dirty fighter in this fight. But it's a very tough fight for him. Terrence is a very good fighter. And just to put a spotlight on Robbie Lawler, this will be his final fight in his professional MMA career. He's been in many great fights. Of course, who could forget his fights against Rory McDonald? Some of the best fights in UFC history have involved this man right here, Robbie Lawler. Also on this card is highly touted prospect Bonickal. He was supposed to go up against former, I would say, tough finalist Tresean Gore. Tresean was supposed to be in the final of Tough, but was forced to pull out due to a knee injury. And he also had to pull out of this fight due to an injury. Bo has a new opponent, and that will be Val Woodburn. But let's face it, I don't see how anybody could stop the Bonickal hype train just yet. Jalen Turner versus Dan Hooker will also be on this card, and it's another amazing fight. But I think Jalen is the better fighter on the feet, and that will lead him to victory. Also on the card is the number one contenders match for the middleweight title between Robert Whittaker and dricusduplessis. I said it before and I'll say it again. Robert Whittaker is hands down the second best middleweight in the world, behind Izzy. And he will show that against Dricus. There's levels to this, and Robert is a level above everybody else, but Izzy is a level above him. For the co-main event, Alexandrepantoja versus Brandon Moreno 2, but in reality, 3, for Brandon's flyweight title. I consider it to be the third fight, as they did fight once in The Ultimate Fighter Season 24 and once in the actual UFC. And Pantoja won both of those matches, but since those matchups, they have grown a lot. I'll start this off by talking about Alexandre Pantoja. Pantoja has a record of 25 wins, 5 losses, with 18 of his wins coming by finish. He has never been finished in his 5 losses, and his last loss came almost 3 years ago. And I know you've heard of this already multiple times. He has beaten Brandon 2 times already, finishing him once and winning a decision the other. Pantoja also hasn't fought since July, so that might affect him after a long layoff like that. Getting to how I see Pantoja fight, starting off with the most standout of all the skills is his ground game. Literally everything from takedown defense to submission game, he is probably the best flyweight on the ground. Top level jiu-jitsu, but he's no slouch on the feet. He'll go straight to the fight. The pressure Pantoja applies is crazy. There has been some fights where Pantoja has tired out towards the end, but I don't expect this fight to last that long. There are times Pantoja comes in a little crazy, but that hasn't caused him to be truly hurt. Pantoja also very rarely uses his kicks to his advantage. Now for the champion, Brandon Moreno. Brandon has a record of 21 wins, 6 losses, and 2 draws, with 16 of his wins coming by finish. His last loss came to Davison Figueiredo by a somewhat controversial decision. Now, talking a little bit about Brandon's style, first talking about Brandon's boxing. It gets better and better each fight. He trains with a great boxing trainer in Jorge Capatillo, but on the ground, Brandon is no pushover. He could hang in there with the best of them. And there's even times where Brandon is the one initiating the takedown. Brandon's stand-up is not one-dimensional. He's a very creative kicker as well. And they are a big part of how Brandon fights. The biggest problem I see Brandon facing in this fight is Brandon does at times have trouble staying out of submissions. I honestly believe Pantoja knows exactly what to do to beat Brandon. He's done it twice, and both times they were very convincing. He's figured out Brandon's style, and yes, you could say it's been 5 years since their last fight, and Brandon has become champion, and there is that one saying, a fighter becomes 10 times better when he becomes a champion. And yes, Brandon has grown over the years, but also has Pantoja. So if I were to pick a winner, it would be Pantoja, just from what he's shown in the prior 2 fights, but personally, as a fan, I will be rooting for Brandon. Now for the main event, undisputed champion Alexander Volkanovski versus interim champ Yairrodriguez. First, talking about interim champ Yairrodriguez. Yair has a record of 15 wins, 3 losses, and 1 no contest. He has won 9 of his fights by finish. He is going into the fight being the obviously taller, lankier fighter as most of the opponents in Volk's career. Getting straight into how I believe Yair fights, Yair is incredibly creative on his feet. There's many punches and kicks that Yair lands that you won't see anyone else land. Yair does a great job moving around the ring and staying active. He's very dangerous at all times, even on the ground. His elbows are extremely dangerous if he's on the bottom or even on the top. His last loss was to the guy who Volk beat 3 times already in Max Holloway. The one thing I will say is Yair at times does get a little too confident on defense and drops his hands. His kicks are going to be very important in this fight so he can keep the distance from Volk. And now for the champion, Alexander Volkanovski. Volk has a record of 25 wins, 2 losses, with 15 of his wins coming by finish. Volk is what many people see as a pound-for-pound great. a fighter who has truly dominated his weight class and has looked better and better each and every fight. And yes, that's true. Even in his last fight with the pound for pound number one fighter, Islam Makhachev, Volk looked good. I don't believe Volk won, but I don't think he was dominated either. And Volk was daring to be great, jumping up a weight class, looking to become a double champion. Prior to that loss, Volk was on a 22 fight win streak. His last loss was in his fourth professional fight by knockout when he was at welterweight. How crazy is that? From starting your career at welterweight to being one of the greatest featherweights of all time. Now, talking about how I see Volk fight. He has a good takedown defense and his low height gives him such an advantage. His build is just crazy. He's so big and wide for this weight class. He is great on the feet. He's such a hard puncher. Volk has a very high ring IQ as well. Prior to his fight with Islam, he was working so much wrestling and jiu-jitsu. It's 100% going to be a problem for Yair. He showed in the fight with Islam Makhachev he was capable of hanging with probably the best wrestler in the UFC. Another thing I see is when Volk attacks, he comes in pretty wild and reckless. Every time I see Volk, I just see a muscle hamster. Volk's got to be one of the strongest guys each of his opponents have faced. Getting back to Volk's stand-up, he does a good job mixing up his punches between head and body. He's very fast. Volk also does a really good job in the ground, and the clinch work is very underrated. For who I have winning this fight, I believe Alexander Volkanovski will be victorious, but again, I will be rooting for Yair being a Mexican. I will always be backing whatever Mexican fights, no matter what. For Chivas' match, they played Leon Monday night, and the first half was very evenly matched. Even on the scoreboard, they went into the half 1-1, with Chivas scoring off of a semi-controversial goal from Pollo Briseño, only to have Leon equalize minutes later after Chivas lost the ball deep into their own half. As a fan, I didn't like how Chivas played the first half. They looked very uncreative, really missing Alexis Vega and Piojo Alvarado. Pavel Perez did start, and honestly, he should be used off the bench as a revulsivo. As the first half started, it was a lot of the same, until the debutantes came in. Juan Brígido came in first for Pavel Perez, and I really liked how he played. He did a nice job dribbling and even sent a perfect pass to Pocho that Pocho missed. Then came in a 17-year-old Yael Padilla for Cone Brizuela. And what can you say about this young man? He comes in and scores the winner. What a great win for Chivas to be able to get 3 points from a very tough opponent like Leon with no Vega, no Alvarado, or even no Tiva Sepulveda. Next, they play Atlético San Luis, a good team who's coming off of a draw to the last torneo's super leader, Rayados. This is no easy game, especially with Leon's goalkeeper, Andres Sanchez. San Luis has always been a tough team for Chivas as they haven't beaten them since August 2020. I believe Chivas wins this game 1-0, but again, with all their absences, I wouldn't be disappointed with a draw or a loss. For the Mexican national team, Mexico will be playing the second place team in Group C, Costa Rica, and honestly, who cares? Mexico is supposed to win, and that's what they will do. They will beat Costa Rica 2-0. Thank you guys for staying until the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and follow me on Twitter at StopTheCount10. See you next week as I talk about what happened in these fights and the soccer matches. See you then.